Have you ever had that really unsettling feeling, like maybe you're walking through the financial district of a major city, or even just scrolling through your feed, and it suddenly feels like the people at the very top of the economic ladder aren't just living in a different tax bracket, but, an entirely different parallel reality.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, like a reality where the basic laws of physics or consequence or even just human suffering simply do not apply to them in the same way they apply to everyone else.
Yeah, it's a really profound sense of alienation. And usually it just gets chalked up to politics or, basic greed. We tend to assume the system is just operating as intended, and some people are simply winning a very, very ruthless game.
Well, welcome to Today in the Hypothesis, because today we are tearing that assumption completely down.
We really are.
Yeah, we are diving into this massive stack of multidisciplinary research, and it's anchored by a genuinely, paradigm-shifting paper by Victor H. Sertouche. And he looks at this class divide not through the lens of economics, which is what you'd expect, but through clinical psychopathology.
Right.
So the mission today is to explore this question that has just been echoing in my head since I read the first page of this thing. What if society's extreme wealth divide functions identically, and I mean biologically, structurally, historically identically, to a traumatized, fractured human brain?
It's a massive question, and it forces us to completely reevaluate the social contract, honestly, because Satouche takes frameworks that were built to understand severe childhood trauma, and he scales them up to the macro-sociological level.
Yeah.
He's combining sociology, evolutionary neurobiology, urban architecture, and even literature to explain what he calls the class empathy gap.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because scaling a localized psychiatric disorder to an entire global economy feels like a massive conceptual leap.
It is a big leap.
How does the paper justify treating millions of disparate, independent people as a single traumatized psychological entity? Like, exactly what kind of trauma disorder are we even mapping onto the economy here?
So we are looking specifically at something called structural dissociation.
Okay.
In clinical psychology, this is basically the gold standard framework for understanding how the human mind survives chronic, inescapable trauma, usually inflicted during early childhood development.
Right.
When a child is subjected to continuous horror, profound abuse or neglect, their developing psyche simply cannot integrate that level of existential threat into a functioning daily existence. The cognitive load would literally destroy them.
So the brain just, it deploys a defense mechanism.
Exactly, a radical defense mechanism. It builds a firewall. It literally splits the personality into distinct, non-communicating parts.
It compartmentalizes the suffering so the host organism can just, survive the day.
Precisely. It divides the psyche into two primary categories. So the first is the ANP, which stands for the apparently normal part.
The apparently normal part.
Yeah.
Got it.
Right. And the ANP is tasked with navigating the external world. It gets up, goes to school, goes to work, forms superficial relationships. It maintains the outward appearance of functionality.
But to do that, it has to ignore the trauma, right?
Exactly. To do this successfully, the AMP must aggressively, biologically repress and avoid any access to the traumatic memories. So it's characterized by this emotional numbing and a terrifying detachment from the underlying pain.
But the pain has to go somewhere, right? The brain doesn't just vaporize it.
No, it doesn't. The pain is quarantined inside the EP, or the emotional part, or sometimes there are multiple emotional parts.
Okay.
And the EP remains permanently locked in a state of primal survival, fight, flight, freeze, or collapse. It holds all the visceral terror, the physiological arousal, the unresolved trauma. The individual is literally fragmented.
Wow.
Now, Sertouche's absolute genius here is recognizing that a highly stratified, deeply unequal society behaves with the exact same pathological architecture.
So he's arguing that the collective social consciousness itself is in a state of structural dissociation.
Yes.
And when you look at the class structure through this lens, the parallels are honestly disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
The high-resource class, so the ultra-wealthy and the affluent, they function as the macro-sociological equivalent of the elite ANP.
They are the apparently normal part of society. Think about it. They govern the civic spaces, they dictate the economic policies, they set the cultural norms. And crucially, their primary psychological and systemic function is to avoid the structural trauma of poverty.
Right.
They maintain this illusion of an orderly, functioning, meritocratic world because they have successfully insulated themselves from the reality of the societal floor.
While the low-resource class, the marginalized and the impoverished, They function as the systemic emotional part. They are the societal EP. They are forced to bear the physical, psychological, and historical trauma of chronic deprivation, like systemic exploitation. They're the ones locked in survival mode, constantly navigating the structural violence that the elite A&P just refuses to acknowledge.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, in a healthy developmental trajectory, a human child goes through various distinct ego states. But usually by age 6 to 9, a process called integration occurs. The child realizes all these different feelings and experiences belong to one cohesive self.
Okay, so they merge.
Right. But trauma arrests that process, leading to what clinicians call primary integration failure.
Primary integration failure. Okay, I'm struggling a bit to conceptualize the sociological version of that. Like, what prevents a society from integrating its collective consciousness? What is the societal equivalent of a traumatizing event that permanently fractures our shared reality?
It is the compounding effect of structural violence. So it's class-based segregation. It's the historical legacy of redlining, systemic racism. These aren't just, unfortunate historical footnotes.
Right.
They are active, ongoing mechanisms of primary integration failure. Because these barriers exist, society can never form a shared, unified, collective memory.
Ah, I see.
The affluent experience the system as protective and rewarding. The marginalized experience the system as predatory and punitive. Because these two realities are just mutually exclusive, the social consciousness remains permanently fragmented.
So it's like society is a single body, but the brain has actively severed the nerve endings to the hand so it doesn't have to feel them burning on a hot stove.
Yes.
It's a defense mechanism, a horrifyingly effective one, to protect the apparently normal functioning of the head while sacrificing the extremities.
That is a perfect analogy. And if we follow the logic of that analogy, a severed nerve ending isn't just a metaphor. It is a biological reality.
Right.
If society is structurally dissociated and the elite A&P is actively severing its connection to the suffering of the systemic EP, we shouldn't just see this in abstract sociological theory. We should be able to measure it in the physical brain waves of the people living in these disparate realities.
And the research in this stack goes incredibly deep into the neurobiology to prove exactly that. It's fascinating. Let's look at the electrical signaling in the brain. The sources highlight event-related potentials, or ERP studies, specifically focusing on the frontocentral P2 response.
Yeah, so event-related potentials allow us to track neurological processing in milliseconds. The P2 response occurs between 128 and 188 milliseconds after a visual stimulus is introduced.
Which is incredibly fast.
It is. This time frame is critical. Human conscious thought, the part of you that actively decides to care about something or form a moral opinion, that takes significantly longer to activate.
Right.
The P2 wave is pre-reflective. It is an automatic, involuntary biological reaction to sensory input.
It's like your biological basement. It's the brain reacting before the mind even knows what it's looking at.
Yeah.
And the researchers designed this study where they showed participants from various socioeconomic backgrounds images of human faces experiencing physical pain.
And the neurobiological divergence they recorded is just stark. Individuals from higher SES or socioeconomic status backgrounds exhibited a physically measurably blunted P2 amplitude compared to lower SES individuals.
Wait, their brains literally did not react as strongly to the visual evidence of another human being in agony?
Exactly. The electrical spike was flattened.
Oh, wow. So it is literally the neurological equivalent of wearing noise-canceling headphones.
Yeah.
The wealthy brain is automatically filtering out the distress signals of others to maintain its own baseline equilibrium.
It is. And that biological filtering mechanism is fascinating on its own, but it becomes deeply unsettling when you contrast it with how these same high SES individuals view themselves.
Oh, right, the survey.
Yeah, the researchers didn't just measure brainwaves, they also administered the Interpersonal Reactivity Index, or IRI. This is a standardized self-report survey used to measure conscious empathy.
And consciously, the affluent participants scored themselves incredibly high. They filled out the surveys claiming, "I am a deeply compassionate person. I care immensely about the suffering of others."
It is the perfect manifestation of the apparently normal part. The conscious self-concept is meticulously maintained. They genuinely believe they are empathetic, moral actors in a just world. Yet, their underlying biological reality at the millisecond level is completely insulated from the pain of others. The conscious narrative and the physiological reality are entirely dissociated.
That is wild. Let's push further into the brain's architecture, because the fMRI studies on the pain matrix reveal an even more calculated biological response. Like when you see someone slam their finger in a car door, your brain doesn't just watch it happen, it simulates it, right?
Right. The anterior cingulate cortex, the insula, the temporoparietal junction, these regions light up, essentially echoing the victim's pain inside your own head.
So that is the foundation of cognitive and affective empathy. But the fMRI data indicates that this pain matrix is not a universal, indiscriminate mirror. It actually has an embedded financial calculator.
Yes, the activation of your pain matrix is highly modulated by your perception of the victim's socioeconomic status.
Which is wild. The sources show that if an observer knows the victim is in a poor financial situation, the pain matrix fires intensely. Like the brain intuitively calculates that without a financial buffer, pain is catastrophic. An injury for someone living paycheck to paycheck could mean eviction, starvation, total ruin. Yeah. The threat level is absolute.
But conversely, if the observer knows the victim is wealthy, the fMRI shows the pain matrix firing significantly less.
Really?
Yes. The brain subconsciously reasons that wealth acts as an impenetrable psychological and physical shield. The affluent victim has access to elite healthcare, time off, physical comfort. The injury is a temporary inconvenience, not an existential threat. Therefore, the observer's brain conserves its empathetic resources.
It is a ruthless biological accounting system. And honestly, it gets much darker than merely conserving empathy. The fMRI data captures a phenomenon I found chilling. When observers watch a wealthy, highly privileged individual experience pain, a completely different region of the brain activates.
The ventral striatum. This is a core component of the brain's reward circuit. It processes dopamine and reinforces pleasurable experiences. When observers see an elite individual suffer, the ventral striatum lights up, providing a measurable neural marker for schadenfreude.
The brain is literally extracting a dopamine reward from the pain of those occupying the top of the hierarchy.
Exactly.
So the biological baseline is deeply fractured. We are either numbing out the pain of the poor or biochemically cheering for the pain of the rich. How does an affluent brain handle the sheer cognitive dissonance of living in a society with such blatant, brutal inequality? Like, if they believe they are good people, how do they process the reality of their own disproportionate advantage?
So, to understand that mechanism, we have to look at how the brain processes rewards and social guilt. The sources detail a remarkably elegant fMRI experiment involving $50.
Oh, this one is fascinating.
Right. Participants are placed in the scanner and randomly assigned to one of two conditions. They either start the experiment with a large monetary endowment of $50 or they start with zero. They are then shown a live feed of a partner who is outside the scanner receiving varying amounts of money.
Okay, so if I am the participant who was randomly assigned to start with nothing, I am in the low resource condition.
Right. Your fMRI data will look highly predictable. Your reward centers, particularly the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the striatum, will fire strongly when you personally receive money.
Makes sense.
However, when you watch your partner receive money, your reward centers remain relatively quiet. Your neurological focus is entirely calibrated to addressing your own immediate resource deficit.
That is basic survival logic. But what happens to the participants who are randomly handed the $50 at the start? The ones placed in the high resource condition?
Their neurological response flips entirely. The affluent participants showed a significantly stronger neural reaction in their reward centers when their poor partner received money than when they themselves received additional money.
I have to admit, when I first read that, it sounded like a biological validation of philanthropy. Like, it sounds like the wealthy person's brain gets a bigger dopamine hit from seeing someone else lifted out of poverty than from getting richer themselves. That sounds incredibly pro-social.
It does appear pro-social on the surface, which is precisely why it is such an effective psychological defense mechanism. But the neurobiological interpretation is far more self-serving. This activation is not purely altruistic. It is driven by a profound need to alleviate visceral discomfort and social guilt. When the affluent brain witnesses wealth being redistributed, crucially, in a highly controlled, non-threatening laboratory setting, it temporarily resolves the cognitive dissonance of their unearned advantage.
Oh, wow.
It allows them to feel that the moral equilibrium of the universe has been restored without them actually having to sacrifice their systemic power. They get the neurological reward of solving inequality simply by observing a localized temporary fairness. Exactly. They preserve their self-serving narrative of being inherently good, moral actors, while the broader system of extraction remains completely unchallenged.
Right. So we've spent a lot of time on the high resource brain, the elite ANP, which is adapting to become insulated, noise-canceling, and deeply focused on maintaining its own moral illusion. But, dissociation is a two-part pathology. What is the biological reality for the systemic EP? What is happening to the low-resource brain?
Well, the low-resource brain is forged in the crucible of chronic, inescapable threat. When an individual develops in a volatile environment plagued by material deprivation and social instability, they cannot afford the luxury of noise-canceling insulation.
Because they're in danger.
Right. They must adopt a highly contextual, hypervigilant cognitive style. They become acutely attuned to the emotional states and behavioral cues of everyone around them because their survival depends entirely on maintaining a reciprocal, interdependent social network.
It is the biological imperative of the marginalized. If you can't buy your way out of a crisis, you have to rely on your community. The research calls this tend and befriend social strategies. But living in a constant state of hypervigilance, constantly scanning for threats and managing complex social dependencies, that takes a massive physiological toll.
A devastating toll, particularly on the developing brains of children. The toxic stress of poverty, the constant physiological arousal of the sympathetic nervous system floods the brain with cortisol and adrenaline. Over time, this chronic chemical bath actively restricts the physical development of the prefrontal cortex, which is the region responsible for executive function, impulse control, and long-term planning.
And the sources compound this physiological stress with data on environmental deprivation. By age 4, children in lower SES households hear up to 30 million fewer words than their middle-class counterparts.
30 million. The linguistic environment is starved, and the physiological environment is toxic. When you look at the brain scans of children raised in severe, chronic poverty, they exhibit structural patterns in their prefrontal cortex that mirror the brain damage seen in adult stroke victims.
That is a staggering comparison. We are talking about literal neurological scarring. The trauma of poverty is etched into the gray matter.
Yes.
So you have this profound, measurable biological fracture. One half of the collective brain is physically blunting its empathy receptors and rationalizing its hoarding, while the other half is structurally damaged by the chronic stress of surviving the deficit. But a biological adaptation this extreme cannot exist in a vacuum, can it? It requires an environment that reinforces it. The elite A&P cannot maintain its illusion of normalcy if it is constantly forced to look at the stroke-like neurological damage of the EP.
Which is precisely why human beings use their resources to construct physical and institutional scaffolding to enforce the dissociation. The biological noise cancellation is externalized into the architecture of our cities. We build spatial boundaries of collective dissociation to guarantee that the two realities never intersect.
The sources refer to this as spatial governmentality. So we are talking about the physical fortification of wealth, gated communities, private security patrols, high perimeter walls.
And it extends far beyond residential walls. It is a comprehensive strategy of microsegregation. An elite enclave can exist geographically mere blocks away from a deeply impoverished neighborhood, but the experiential distance is absolute. The affluent class possesses the capital to voluntarily withdraw from every shared public square.
And when you withdraw from the public square, you create what the paper identifies as structural blind spots. If you live behind a security gate, if you utilize concierge medicine and private doctors, if you send your children to elite private academies, your brain simply generalizes that localized experience.
You develop a profound healthcare blind spot and an education blind spot. You look around your highly curated, privatized environment and conclude, well, the system is functioning beautifully.
Right.
You become structurally incapable of perceiving the collapse of public infrastructure, the underfunding of public schools, or the violence of systemic poverty because you just never physically encounter it.
And I imagine this physical isolation has a massive impact on political behavior. If your brain genuinely believes the public systems are irrelevant to your family's survival, why on earth would you vote to increase your own taxes to fix them? The spatial segregation essentially guarantees the defunding of the public good.
It creates a feedback loop of systemic neglect. But the physical walls are only the first layer of defense. The elite A&P must also legitimize its wealth through institutions that sanitize capital extraction.
Okay, sanitize how?
The sources dedicate significant analysis to the role of elite schools. These institutions are not merely educational facilities, they are profound engines of sociological laundering.
That is a brilliant way to phrase it. Sociological laundering. They take raw, potentially inherited, potentially exploitative economic power, and they wash it. They transform raw cash into what sociologists call symbolic capital. They make the wealth look noble, earned, and intellectually justified.
And they achieve this through a highly managed cultural performance. Elite institutions do not want to appear ostentatious or overtly aristocratic, as that would trigger the resentment of the masses. Instead, they cultivate a performative Spartan aesthetic.
Right, you see the children of billionaires living in cramped, unadorned, centuries-old dormitories. They are required to do their own laundry, eat in communal dining halls, and participate in community service.
It is a meticulous costume of humility. By forcing the elite youth to perform these mundane tasks in a highly exclusive environment, the institution cleanses the moral stain of their massive inequality. It socializes these families to adopt a quiet, self-justifying narrative of merit and hard work. They learn to downplay their structural advantages.
It's like a movie set. It provides the scaffolding for the illusion. The elite schools, the humble aesthetics, the philanthropic galas. It's the front of house. It's the stage play demonstrating how grounded and normal the A&P is. But offstage, deep in the financial architecture, there is nothing humble about how this wealth is protected.
No, behind the performative Spartan aesthetic lies the shadow financial system. The sources detail the mechanisms of confetti and concealment.
Wealth managers, multifamily offices, the armies of lawyers and accountants whose sole purpose is to scatter assets across the globe.
Exactly. They utilize bearer shares, labyrinthine trust structures, and blacklisted offshore tax havens. They blast the capital into 1,000 untraceable pieces, that's the confetti strategy, to isolate elite wealth from the sociological gaze. This shadow architecture ensures the capital is completely shielded from democratic oversight, taxation, and redistribution.
So you have physical walls keeping the marginalized out of sight, elite institutions laundering the morality of the wealth, and shadow financial networks hiding the actual money. It is a masterclass in structural defense.
It really is.
But human beings are inherently meaning-making creatures. Even with all of this physical and financial insulation, you still need a story. You need a narrative to tell yourself when you look in the mirror so you don't feel like a villain.
And this brings us to the ideological shield. To maintain the fragile equilibrium of structural dissociation, the collective elite A&P must possess a robust, self-justifying cognitive framework that explains away the suffering they are inherently tied to.
Right.
The absolute foundational pillar of this psychological defense is the just world fallacy.
Which is the deeply ingrained cognitive bias that the universe is inherently fair and therefore people ultimately get exactly what they deserve.
Yes. For high-resource individuals, the just world fallacy is not merely a philosophical stance. It is a vital psychological coping mechanism. It is the only way to neutralize the existential anxiety of possessing vast, unearned privilege in a world full of suffering. If the world is just and the market is a perfect arbiter of value, then my immense wealth is empirical proof of my intrinsic virtue, intelligence, and effort. But the just world fallacy is constantly under attack by reality. How does an affluent person look out the tinted window of their luxury SUV, see undeniable, crushing, generational poverty on the street corner, and not have their worldview shatter?
Through a process called cognitive assimilation, which almost invariably requires the derogation of the victim.
Derogation of the victim.
Right. Rather than admitting the system is fundamentally rigged, an admission that would collapse their entire insulated reality, the affluent brain unconsciously alters its perception of the victim to fit the just world narrative.
Oh, so they attribute the poverty entirely to individual moral or intellectual failings. They must be lazy. They must have made terrible financial choices. They must lack ambition.
Precisely. The brain facilitates dispositional attributions for the failure of others while simultaneously ignoring all systemic obstacles. It willfully blinds itself to the historical reality of redlining, discriminatory lending practices, chronically underfunded public education. By blaming the victim, the elite A&P maintains its own innocence.
And this brings us to the ultimate buzzword of modern corporate society, the word that is used to justify almost every inequality in the Western world: meritocracy. The sources dive into the history of this concept, and it completely subverted everything I thought I knew. I have always heard meritocracy used as the highest possible compliment.
It functions today as the ultimate status legitimizing belief. It is the ideological bedrock that convinces successful people they are morally superior to those beneath them. But the term was not coined as an ideal. It was coined by British sociologist Michael Young in 1958.
And he didn't mean it as a blueprint for a perfect society.
No, he used it to describe a dystopian nightmare. In his satirical book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, Young envisioned a society where social status was rigidly determined by an arbitrary metric of intelligence plus effort.
Wow.
He warned that this system would establish an unfeeling, arrogant elite who believed they owed nothing to the lower classes because their success was earned, thereby justifying the most extreme and callous inequalities imaginable.
Wait. If meritocracy was literally invented to describe a dystopian, arrogant social order, how did it get completely inverted? How did it become the mission statement of every Ivy League university and Fortune 500 company? It feels like the most successful rebranding campaign in human history.
This raises an important question, right? The rebranding was successful because societies desperately require ideologies that justify hierarchy. But this concept, the idea that material success is proof of moral worth, did not begin in the 1950s. The sources trace its lineage back through deep historical and theological roots. If we look at Max Weber's seminal 1905 sociological analysis of the Protestant ethic and Calvinism, we see the blueprint.
Okay, this goes back to the doctrine of double predestination, the terrifying theological concept that God had already decided long before you were born whether you were destined for eternal salvation or eternal damnation.
And crucially, there was absolutely nothing you could do to change it.
Right.
Because their eternal fate was predetermined and unknowable, early Calvinists were consumed by an unprecedented psychological terror. They desperately sought a sign, any sign, that they were part of the elect, the chosen few. Weber argued that over time they began to view economic success, achieved through relentless, rationalized hard work, as the empirical proof of divine favor.
So getting rich wasn't just about accumulating comfort. It became a religious imperative. It was the only way to prove to your neighbors and to yourself that God actually liked you.
Exactly. Work transformed from a mere means of physical survival into a moral calling. Wealth became a proxy for grace. And while the strict Calvinist theology has largely faded, its psychological architecture remains fully intact. We see its direct modern descendant in the prosperity gospel.
The televangelists and megachurch pastors who preach that if you sow financial seeds, God will bless you with a private jet and a mansion.
Yes. Prosperity theology explicitly teaches that God directly rewards faith and positive thinking with material wealth. It is incredibly appealing to the affluent because it frames their abundance as undeniable proof of their spiritual righteousness. Conversely, and far more insidiously, it pathologizes the poor, suggesting their poverty is simply the result of a lack of faith or a spiritual failing.
And if you don't buy into the theology, the sources show how the secular world constructed the exact same ideological shield using the language of science during the Gilded Age, primarily through social Darwinism.
Right. Theorists like Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner took Charles Darwin's highly specific biological concepts of natural selection and evolutionary fitness and grossly, deliberately misapplied them to human economics. They argued that the wealthy were biologically fit and the poor were naturally unfit.
And they weaponized this pseudoscience to argue against the very concept of a social safety net. They claimed that passing labor laws, limiting working hours, or providing public charity to the poor was actually interfering with human evolution.
It provided a seemingly objective, scientific justification for supreme callousness. It asserted that public aid was an unwise interference with a natural eugenic sorting process. Whether you wrapped it in the theological robes of Calvinism or the prosperity gospel, or you disguise it in the pseudoscientific language of social Darwinism, or you rebrand it as modern corporate meritocracy, the core function remains absolutely identical.
They are all psychological defense mechanisms.
Exactly. They are the software that runs the elite ANP, legitimizing the hoarding of resources and actively blocking any true systemic empathy for the marginalized EP.
And what makes this research so compelling is that we don't just have to analyze 19th century theology to prove this software exists. We can watch it boot up and take over human behavior in real time. We have to talk about the empirical proof, specifically the UC Berkeley rigged monopoly experiment. I want to spend some time living in this laboratory setting because the details are staggering.
It is a landmark study in behavioral economics and social psychology. The researchers brought over 100 pairs of complete strangers into a laboratory to play a standard game of Monopoly. But the game was blatantly, undeniably rigged to create immense structural inequality from the very first second.
They didn't hide the rigging, right?
Yeah.
A simple public coin flip determined who was going to be the rich player and who was going to be the poor player.
Exactly. The structural advantages were overwhelming. The rich player was given twice as much starting money. Every time they passed go, they collected twice the normal salary. And crucially, they were allowed to roll 2 dice instead of 1, meaning they moved around the board much faster, buying up property and accumulating wealth at double the speed of their impoverished opponent.
And this is all happening with hidden cameras recording their micro-expressions and body language for 15 minutes. Both players know it's completely unfair. The coin flip happened right in front of them. It is pure dumb luck. So how do the rich players behave as the game progresses and their wealth snowballs?
Their behavior changes dramatically and almost immediately. As they begin to dominate the board, the rich players exhibit physical signs of dominance. They begin to move their game pieces with aggressive force, banging them loudly against the board to emphasize their progress. They start exhibiting triumphant chest-thumping gestures. Their verbal communication changes. They display rude, dismissive, and overtly condescending behavior toward their disadvantaged opponent.
And the detail that I cannot get over, they ate more pretzels.
Yes.
The researchers placed a communal bowl of pretzels on the side of the table, ostensibly for both players to share. And the hidden cameras show the rich players just dominating the pretzel bowl, reaching in constantly, consuming the shared resource without hesitation.
It highlights how rapidly the acquisition of unearned advantage alters one's relationship to shared resources. The moment you are placed in a structurally superior position, you begin to consume more, physically and economically, without even consciously registering the inequity. The rigged monopoly board is a perfect miniature simulation of our broader economy.
But the truly terrifying part of this study wasn't the aggressive behavior during the game. It was the psychological gymnastics that happened afterward.
The post-game interviews reveal the core mechanics of the ideological shield we just discussed. Remember, the rich players knew they possessed absolute, undeniable knowledge that a random coin flip secured their massive advantage. Yet, when asked by researchers why they won the game, they did not attribute their victory to the rigged rules.
They credited their own brilliance.
They talked extensively about their tactical choices. They highlighted their clever property acquisitions and their strategic resource management. The human brain completely rationalized an arbitrary structural advantage as a deserved outcome of their superior effort and skill. The just world fallacy and the meritocratic illusion manifested spontaneously, completely overriding the objective reality of the coin flip.
It's proof that the brain will actively rewrite reality to justify its own dominance. And this isn't just a quirky phenomena that happens with board games in a lab. It translates directly into real-world behavior, particularly when we look at how different classes distribute their actual wealth. The sources cite a laboratory study measuring generosity through a $10 endowment.
Yes. In this study, participants were given $10 and told they could share any portion of it with an anonymous stranger. If you believe the narrative that wealth allows for greater philanthropy, you would hypothesize that those with more financial security would be more generous.
Right, because they can afford it.
Exactly. But the results showed the exact opposite. Participants with lower household incomes, those earning under $25,000 or even below $15,000 annually, gave 44% more of their endowment to the stranger than their wealthy counterparts earning between $150,000 and $200,000.
44% more. The people who desperately needed that $10 were the ones willing to share it. And that is localized lab data, but the sources point out that this perfectly matches the national IRS data on charitable giving.
The macro data confirms the micro behavior. On average, middle-class households earning between $50,000 and $75,000 donate 7.6% of their income to charity. Households earning over $100,000 see their donation rate drop to 4.2%.
And it gets even more extreme when you factor in the spatial segregation we talked about earlier, the gated communities, the spatial governmentality.
When analysts look specifically at elite ZIP codes, neighborhoods where over 40% of households earn more than $200,000 annually, the charitable giving rate plummets to a mere 2.8%. The spatial insulation, the physical walls of the elite A&P, actively erodes pro-social behavior. When you never see the need, when you never interact with the EP, you never feel compelled to meet that need.
It is a fundamental disregard for the social contract, which is illustrated beautifully and tragically by the California crosswalk study.
This is a fascinating piece of observational field research. In California, state law mandates that drivers must yield the right-of-way to pedestrians waiting at a marked crosswalk. Researchers staked out intersections and tracked hundreds of vehicles, categorizing them by their estimated market value. The vehicle's value served as a highly visible proxy for the driver's socioeconomic status.
So they're watching to see who actually obeys the social contract when they are behind the wheel. What did the drivers in the cheap cars do?
0% of the drivers in the lowest cost vehicle category broke the law. Every single one of them stopped and yielded to the pedestrian.
But the drivers in the luxury cars.
Nearly 50% of the drivers in the most expensive vehicle category completely ignored the pedestrian, cruising right through the crosswalk and violating the law.
The expensive car acts exactly like the gated community. It is a physical shield of glass and steel that isolates the driver from the vulnerability of the public square. They feel entitled to navigate shared spaces at their own speed, completely disregarding the safety of anyone outside their immediate high-status sphere.
And we must continually contextualize all of this behavioral data, the cheating at Monopoly, the hoarding of resources, the disregard for pedestrians, within the brutal systemic reality of historical wealth inequality.
Right.
The sources anchor this behavior with 2016 data on the racial wealth gap, demonstrating how these psychological defense mechanisms perpetuate tangible, devastating harm. In 2016, white families who have been historically advantaged and protected by the system posted a median wealth of $171,000. Black families, who have been historically subjected to redlining, spatial segregation, and systemic disadvantage, posted a median wealth of just $17,600.
Almost 10 times less. That is an undeniable structural fracture.
Yeah.
It's the quantifiable proof of a society that has completely failed to integrate.
Yeah.
And when you look at how aggressively the elite class defends this hoard of resources, how quickly they justify it, it feels so primal. It feels like we are fighting against an ancient survival instinct.
We are.
And according to the evolutionary biology and the sources, we absolutely are. We need to talk about oxytocin.
We must. Oxytocin is perhaps the most misunderstood hormone in popular science. It is widely and dangerously inaccurately known as the cuddle hormone.
Right, it's the chemical released during childbirth to bond a mother to her infant. It spikes when you hug someone you love or when you pet a dog. It's supposed to be the biological foundation of love, empathy, and universal human connection.
But evolutionary biology reveals a profound caveat. Empathy did not evolve as a limitless universal capacity. In the harsh environments of early hominid evolution, universal empathy would have been a fatal flaw. Empathy evolved as a highly adaptive survival tool strictly within small, cooperative family units and tribes. You had to be exquisitely attuned to the emotional and physical needs of your immediate network to survive famine and predators. Oxytocin is the neuromodulator that dampens the fear response in your amygdala, allowing you to trust and cooperate with those closest to you.
I am struggling to reconcile that. If oxytocin is literally the chemical of maternal love and deep social bonding, how on earth is it the same chemical driving a hedge fund manager to exploit a tax loophole and hoard wealth? Those seem like completely opposite biological imperatives.
They seem opposite until you understand that oxytocin inherently drives parochialism.
Parochialism.
This means that the exact same chemical mechanism that upregulates in-group love, trust, and intense conformity simultaneously upregulates out-group hate. It drives defensive and even preemptively offensive aggression against competing outgroups. Love for the tribe biologically necessitates hostility toward the rival tribe competing for the same scarce resources.
So it's not the cuddle hormone, it's the us versus them hormone. How does this biological parochialism actually manifest in modern human behavior?
We see it vividly in intergroup economic contest games conducted in laboratories. Researchers utilize double-blind, placebo-controlled studies where they administer intranasal oxytocin to participants. The common assumption was that oxytocin would make everyone more peaceful and cooperative across the board.
But it didn't.
The results proved the exact opposite. The oxytocin did not create universal harmony. Instead, it enhanced the participants' ability to coordinate highly profitable, well-timed, and aggressive attacks on competing outgroups. It made them better at exploiting the vulnerable, strictly for the benefit of their own in-group.
The sources draw a direct line between this human economic behavior and the behavior of wild chimpanzees, which is terrifying.
The parallel is striking. Primatologists studying wild chimpanzees observed their behavior preparing for violent territorial conflicts. They found massive spikes in urinary oxytocin immediately before and during these intergroup battles. The oxytocin creates a band of brothers effect. It binds the in-group tightly together, suppressing internal conflict so they can effectively and ruthlessly wage war against the outsiders.
So the very chemical that makes us capable of profound love and self-sacrifice is the exact same chemical that fuels exclusionary zoning laws, tax evasion, and the hoarding of systemic wealth. That is a terrifying paradox. It means NIMBYism, not in my backyard, isn't just a political stance. It's a primal, oxytocin-driven defense mechanism.
It is the biological engine powering the structural dissociation of society. In a highly stratified culture, this evolutionary biology is seamlessly co-opted. The elite in-group, the AMP, utilizes their vast resources to coordinate highly effective corporate and political attacks. They lobby for deregulation, they construct tax shelters, they dismantle the social safety net.
Right.
They are fiercely protecting their in-group's prosperity, fueled by biological parochialism. And crucially, they view the marginalized outgroup, the EP, not as fellow citizens to be integrated, but as a distant competing threat to be managed, policed, and controlled.
But we cannot analyze this macro-sociological divide as if class exists in a sterile vacuum, because it doesn't. A person's experience of this biological and structural dissociation is heavily dictated by their intersecting identities. Class realities are inextricably entangled with gender and race.
Absolutely. The paper emphasizes that socioeconomic dissociation interacts dynamically with other axes of social identity. A profound example of this is how class interacts with rigid gender norms, specifically highlighting the precarious manhood hypothesis.
Because patriarchal societies demand that men embody specific high-status traits to be considered valid agency, independence, and above all, financial dominance. A man's societal worth is fundamentally tied to his capacity to provide and extract resources.
Exactly. When a man fails to acquire those resources or loses his income, he violates the core tenet of his gender role. Consequently, he is penalized far more severely by society than a woman in the exact same financial position. Low-income men face intense social distance and overt direct hostility. They are aggressively stereotyped as lazy, dangerous, or unmotivated. Their loss of economic status equates to a loss of manhood in the eyes of the dominant culture.
But for women, the intersection of class and gender creates a completely different set of systemic traps.
The sources utilize shifting standards theory to explain the female experience within this hierarchy. High-status women who have managed to acquire significant resources and power face a complex landscape of penalization. Unlike high-status men whose dominance is expected and rewarded, high-status women are often met with deep skepticism.
Right.
The threshold for a woman to be deemed outstanding or competent in a male-dominated corporate hierarchy is significantly higher. Furthermore, they face a vicious double standard regarding emotional expression. They are routinely penalized for exhibiting dominant emotions like anger or pride, the very emotions that are expected and praised in male leaders.
And this cultural expectation of female softness ties into the gender empathy gap, or what researchers call the women are wonderful effect.
The women are wonderful effect is a well-documented psychological bias where women are generally evaluated more positively than men in domains of warmth, morality, and empathic capacity. And behavioral data often supports this stereotype. Women consistently score higher on self-reported empathy measures and perform better on cognitive empathy tasks.
But the paper introduces a crucial, devastating caveat to this bias. It introduces the concept of intersectional invisibility, which specifically targets and isolates low-income, historically marginalized women.
This is a vital nuance. The apparent societal advantage of the women are wonderful effect is completely bound by class and racial lines. Women from low-income, marginalized backgrounds suffer from intersectional invisibility because they are deemed non-prototypical by the dominant culture.
Meaning, they don't fit the mental shortcut society uses to categorize people. When the elite A&P pictures women, they default to middle-class, often white women, and when they picture the working class, they default to the imagery of working-class men in hard hats.
Precisely. Because marginalized women do not neatly fit the prototype of either category, they fall into a cognitive blind spot. They are essentially overlooked in sociological analysis, policy creation, and political discourse. They are erased from the dominant narrative entirely.
I am trying to wrap my head around the lived reality of that erasure. It's like being a ghost in your own society. You might escape some of the direct, overt hostility and policing that low-status men face simply because people literally aren't looking at you. But the cost of that invisibility is absolute powerlessness. You have zero political leverage. You are invisible to the system.
That invisibility severely limits their social influence, their political representation, and their access to capital, permanently cementing their marginalization. The core takeaway here is that being poor is a profound structural trauma, but the specific flavor, intensity, and societal reaction to that trauma is heavily dictated by the gender and racial expectations layered on top of it.
To truly understand how these invisible lines, these ghost-like realities, and this structural dissociation are captured by the people actually living them, we have to look at how society records its own temperature. We look to art and culture.
We do.
The sources provide two brilliant cultural reflections of these parallel realities, demonstrating that this clinical pathology has been recognized by artists for a century. Let's start with S. Scott Fitzgerald's 1925 masterpiece, The Great Gatsby.
What is fascinating about Fitzgerald's work, when viewed through Surtuche's framework, is that it reads less like a tragic romance and more like a pristine sociological case study of the elite AMP. Fitzgerald ruthlessly dissects how extreme, inherited wealth corrupts basic morality, biologically limits empathy, and provides total, impenetrable insulation from consequence. We see this pathology perfectly embodied in the characters of Tom and Daisy Buchanan.
They are the ultimate, horrifying archetypes of old money dissociation.
They are completely protected by inherited fortune. Because of this, they maintain a chilling, indifferent distance from the struggles of anyone outside their immediate sphere. As the paper eloquently notes, they literally think in money. They utilize their vast resources to manipulate the truth, evade legal and moral accountability, and maintain their insulated equilibrium.
After the climax of the novel, after the tragic, violent deaths of Myrtle, George, and Gatsby himself, deaths that Tom and Daisy are directly responsible for, Fitzgerald writes the defining diagnosis of the elite class. He writes that Tom and Daisy just retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness and let other people clean up the mess. It is the perfect, terrifying description of structural dissociation. They physically and psychologically flee the scene. They do not have to process the trauma they caused because their wealth acts as an absolute firewall.
And Fitzgerald explicitly contrasts their pristine, insulated existence with the Valley of Ashes, the poverty-stricken, dust-covered industrial wasteland where the working class lives and dies. He illustrates a hopelessly fragmented hierarchy where the wealthy simply consume the labor, the bodies, and the lives of the poor as disposable, interchangeable objects.
And then there's the tragedy of Jay Gatsby himself, the ultimate avatar of the American dream, the belief that anyone can work their way into the A&P.
Gatsby is a tragic figure because his trajectory exposes the fundamental falsity of upward mobility in a deeply stratified, dissociated society. He accumulates immense wealth, albeit through criminal bootlegging, but he is ultimately brutally rejected by the old money elite. Why? Because of his impoverished North Dakota background. He lacks the required aristocratic breeding and the shared cultural memory of the elite.
His wealth is just a gold hat, as the book calls it. It's a material deception, a costume he wears to try and win Daisy. But it proves that class is not merely an economic metric. It is a rigidly policed cultural barrier. It's about the collective acceptance of the in-group, which transitions perfectly to the second cultural touchstone analyzed in the sources, which tackles the absurdity of the elite trying to cross that barrier in reverse. Pulp's 1995 Britpop anthem, Common People.
It is a biting, visceral musical critique of class tourism or slumming. The song, penned by Jarvis Cocker, recounts a real-life encounter with a wealthy Greek art student studying at St. Martin's College, who expresses a romanticized desire to live like common people and experience working-class life.
It is the exact same pathology we see today, with rich influencers dressing down in working-class chic for a gritty urban photo shoot, pretending to be broke, and then getting back into a chauffeured SUV. They crave the aesthetic of grit, but they're entirely insulated from the gravity of it.
The song brilliantly exposes the fundamental, insurmountable asymmetry of that interaction. The wealthy art student can rent a cheap, roach-infested flat above a supermarket. She can mimic the aesthetics of poverty and play at being poor as an exotic form of temporary escapism, but the central lyric of the song cuts straight to the core of the class divide. If you called your dad, he could stop it all.
That one line changes the entire reality. Because she possesses an escape hatch, her experience of poverty is nothing more than an aesthetic performance.
Exactly. For the working class, for the societal EP, poverty is not an aesthetic choice or a sociological experiment. It is an inescapable, grinding material reality defined by a terrifying lack of control and a total absence of financial safety nets. The wealthy tourist remains fundamentally and permanently dissociated from the true, visceral fear of the disenfranchised. They view the lived trauma of the EP as a temporary amusement park ride.
And this brings us to the final and, frankly, the most disturbing mechanism of this entire system. How does the affluent class ensure that their aestheticized, sanitized version of reality, the reality where they are the meritocratic heroes and poverty is just a character flaw, how do they ensure that is the only reality that survives in the history books? How does the society actively forget the trauma of the marginalized?
It is executed through the architecture of collective memory. Sociologists, drawing from foundational thinkers like Maurice Halbwachs and Emile Durkheim, draw a crucial distinction between collective memory, which is the memory of individuals as part of a specific group, and social memory, which is how a society autonomously communicates its past through structural institutions, laws, archives, and symbols.
And these macro systems interact with our microbiology to ensure individuals internalize the dominant sanitized narrative.
On a cognitive neurological level, this process is driven by a terrifying phenomenon known as mnemonic conformity.
Let's slow down and unpack this because it blew my mind. Mnemonic conformity means that when you are presented with information or a narrative from your in-group, your brain chemistry literally alters its own cognitive processing to align your personal memory with the group's narrative.
That is precisely what the neurobiological data indicates. It is not merely a matter of a person consciously lying to fit in at a dinner party or a boardroom. The underlying cognitive encoding and retrieval processes physically change. The brain actively alters the memory to ensure social cohesion and maintain standing within the powerful in-group.
So the people in the elite A and P aren't even consciously lying to protect their wealth or their privilege. Their brains are literally editing their memories, writing out the ugly parts, erasing the systemic exploitation to keep them safely bonded to their peer group.
It is a profound, evolutionarily deeply rooted biological defense mechanism. And when you place this cognitive quirk inside the highly insulated, physically gated echo chambers of the elite, it scales up into systemic collective forgetting. This is the deliberate, systematic omission of historical exploitation, systemic violence, and resource extraction from the official public record.
Because the dominant group controls the institutions of memory. They fund the selective educational curricula that teach a sanitized history. They commission the statues and the roadside memorials. They establish the massive private foundations that dictate what research gets funded and what narratives are amplified.
By controlling the physical, financial, and institutional markers of memory, the elite A and P physically reconstructs the past to legitimize the current staggering inequality of the present. They systematically discount, ignore, and literally overwrite the lived narratives of the low-resource outgroups. This active, ongoing process of collective forgetting is the final seal that locks the society into a permanent state of structural dissociation. It guarantees that the two parallel realities can never integrate, because the dominant reality utilizes its vast resources to literally write the subordinate reality out of historical existence.
We have covered a massive, intimidating amount of ground today. We have traced the architecture of inequality from the millisecond firing of the P2 brainwave to the psychological gymnastics of a rigged monopoly game, all the way to the spatial fortification of our cities and the biological rewriting of human memory. As we wrap up this deep dive into Sartush's research, how do we synthesize all of this? What is the final diagnosis?
The overarching synthesis is undeniably clear and, frankly, deeply challenging to the modern conscience. The dissociation condition we observe in extreme wealth inequality is not an individual psychological failing. It is not merely a collection of greedy individuals making bad personal choices. It is a collective, systemic, sociological reality rooted in our ancient evolutionary biology. The elite collective brain, literally, spatially, financially, and ideologically constructs an impenetrable, insulated reality to protect itself from the interdependent, threatened, and traumatized reality of the marginalized. We are looking at a society suffering from collective tertiary structural dissociation. The firewall is complete.
And that brings it right back to you, the person listening right now. Take this framework and apply it to your own life. Look closely at your own city tomorrow morning. Where are the physical gates? Where are the institutional blind spots? When you are on your daily commute and you see evidence of the societal EP, how does your own brain process the suffering of others? Are you allowing yourself to feel it? Or has your biological noise cancellation already booted up?
I would leave the listener with this final, perhaps uncomfortable, provocative thought. If our evolutionary biology, our oxytocinergic networks, and our very neural memory structures are actively, constantly working to keep us divided, to keep us hoarding resources, justifying our advantages and avoiding the pain of the outgroup, then true, systemic empathy isn't a natural passive state we can just hope will eventually emerge. It is an act of deliberate, grueling, almost unnatural rebellion against our own biological wiring. The question we have to answer is, are we willing to fight our own brains to heal the social fabric?
What a profound and terrifying question to end on. If this analysis shifted your perspective or challenged the way you see the world, be sure to subscribe and share this with someone who loves a good paradigm shift. Thank you for joining us. See you next time on Today in a Hypothesis.